Okay, welcome everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's nearing the end of Ramadan. We're all very hungry for iftar to eat some samosas, but you're still coming back. I can't get you to stop coming back. I really appreciate that you're here. Today we're going to go into a very deep topic, Islamic philosophy for the love of wisdom. The general housekeeping, again, join us on the Google Classroom. Our Zoom class is full. Maybe if you email me, I can see if I can fit you in. Again, welcome to the YouTube and Facebook Live students. You can ask your questions there. The moderator will send me the questions. Again, let's try to encourage video questions. And when not speaking, please mute yourself and send me feedback. Standard stuff. Some new disclaimers, though. I got this idea from one of the students that it is worthwhile to mention that this course is a broad survey course in which we explore various intellectual trends within Islamic intellectual history. And we will mostly be taking an academic approach to the subject matter. It goes without saying that the views represented herein do not necessarily reflect the views of the Ghamidi Center of Islamic Learning or those of Mr. Javed Ahmad Ghamidi. We talked about traditionalism and rationalism. We contrasted those two. That's kind of a theme in the course. It should be pointed out that Mr. Ghamidi himself, at least if I've understood him correctly, positions himself as a middle way scholar between Islamic traditionalism and rationalism. That is why I've reserved a discussion about the middle way scholars, including Mr. Ghamidi, near the end of the course. Again, the whole point is to contextualize contemporary debates. Again, I need to reiterate, I am not affiliated to the Ghamidi Center in any official way. I'm simply a guest lecturer. I am a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and the Ghamidi Center has been kind enough to allow me to teach this course on Islamic intellectual history. And I think, again, that shows their intellectual openness to do such a thing. The goal of the course, again, is to help you appreciate the intellectual diversity and vast richness of our Islamic heritage. So this can include many groups that may make you uncomfortable or that you disagree with. Again, some views may sit uncomfortably with your strongly held confessional beliefs, and some things you hear may even shock or scandalize you. That's especially true for today's lecture. But my hope is that by appreciating this diversity of thought that characterized our past, it will open up a space for more open and freer religious dialogue in our present. So think about how people try to portray the founder of the Ghamidi Center as if he's the first one to ever say something that everyone else, the entire ummah, is standing on one side and Mr. Javed Ahmad Ghamidi is on another side. Well, when you take a broader lens, you see that Islamic history had all sorts of different views. And so there was quite a lot of diversity. And that's really what the course is all about. All right, another warning for this particular lecture: philosophy is difficult to understand, and it may seem very strange to you initially, especially since it's classical philosophy. They're living in a very different world than we live in today. I know it took me a long time to grasp these concepts because how difficult they were and how strange they are. I am going to try my best to make this understandable to you and break this down. So hopefully we'll get through this together. I do think you should stick with it, and hopefully things will come together next week, especially when we look at Imam Ghazali's quote unquote assault on the Islamic philosophers and Ibn Rushd's response. As you see from the title of next week, it's Ghazali versus the philosophers, Reconciling Religion and Science. So that next class is going to make things a lot more relevant, I think. This class is setting up a lot of that kind of background knowledge that you need in order to deal with the topic next week. So again, it's going to be difficult, strange concepts today, but hopefully next class, when we talk about Ghazali and the philosophers, their battle, a lot of this will make sense why we need all this background knowledge. All right, so let's start this difficult topic with story time. I'm going to tell you a little story. So my father moved to this country from Karachi, Pakistan, when he was very young, around 17 or so years old. And he studied at UC Berkeley. He studied electrical engineering and computer science. After that, he became an engineer in Silicon Valley, which, you know, is the tech capital of the world, you can think of it. That's where he did certain things with the internet. I don't actually know exactly what he did. So we're going to go with a different, something that we all know, which is the iPhone. So in Silicon Valley, they, created the iPhone. Now, the question is that I'm kind of posing, and that's why I'm opening up with this, is why is it that the iPhone was first created in the Silicon Valley, in California, in the United States? Why did my dad have to move from Karachi to California to kind of be on this cutting edge of technology, the internet and all of that? That's a good question. That's kind of, well, let's look at this. This is a chart of the technology needed to create something like the iPhone. And I think it's actually not comprehensive enough. But what we see is that you need all of these different technologies going back all the way to the 1600s or even before that, upon which this technology is built. So you need optics, you need electricity, you need computing, you need all this kind of materials that the product is made out of. So you can't really just, if you were the president of Pakistan or the prime minister of Pakistan, you couldn't simply just say, okay, I'm going to create a kind of institute that's just going to make this kind of technology and we're going to invent these things. No, you need to have all of these other fields kind of mastered and integrated into one kind of worldview. And only then can you or your society, your civilization, create these kind of things. Well, there was a time in Islamic history in which the Islamic world was the source of this consolidation of human knowledge. We go back to the early time. We've seen this map before. The Muslims expanded quite rapidly after the Prophet's death. They took over, again, the Byzantine Empire to the west, which is the Roman Empire, and they took over the Sassanid or the Persian Empire to the east. But it wasn't just a military kind of conquest. There was also a civilizational battle. As the Muslims took these places, they wanted to see themselves as this great civilization and this great power, not just on a military level, but a civilizational, scientific, philosophical, cultural level. This, as we talked about last week, sparked what's called the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid caliphs, again, remember the first caliphs were the Umayyads, then came the Abbasids. The Abbasid caliphs, influenced by Mu'tazilism, which we talked about last week, that is the Islamic rationalists, they tried to consolidate and expand the knowledge of the world from the West and the East, the knowledge from the Romans in the West and the Persians and India as well. Now, this consolidation of knowledge, this knowledge project, likely, of course, had a political aspect to it. They had pretensions to being universal rulers. They wanted to take over a project that they saw the Sassanid emperors and the Roman emperors they were also engaged in. That's what sparked the translation movement. The caliphs are funding translations of major texts that are coming in that are in other languages from in Syria and Persian texts as well. They created the Beit al-Hikmah, as we talked about, which is the House of Wisdom. Now, I should point out that there is a debate about what exactly this was. Was it really an academy or just a library? Was it a symbol of was it just a symbol of a wider scholarly community in Baghdad? Whatever it was, it's clear that Baghdad did become this intellectual hub, the Silicon Valley of its day. It should also be pointed out that golden ages are constructs. Golden ages always imply that there's a decline that came afterward. And so scholars disagree about whether it's proper to call something a golden age or not. But this is how it's popularly known. And what's undeniable is that at this time, the Islamic world was flourishing from a philosophical, scientific, and cultural perspective. This era also started a group called the Islamic philosophers. So we talked about the Islamic theologians last class. These are the mutakallimun, or the Kalam scholars. These are the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris. They do embrace Western knowledge, including logic and science. We saw how both groups, for example, accepted Greek atomism. But there arose this other group, the Islamic philosophers, the falasifa, who felt that these attempts, though praiseworthy, were insufficient due to their lack of systematicity and their dialectical polemical nature. That is, they were of the view that these theologians were simply engaged in debates. They just wanted to score points against their theological or ideological opponents instead of trying to reach truth by scientific demonstration. So these philosophers are going to engage in the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge and wisdom. And that's why I entitled this class For the Love of Wisdom, or Hikmah. Furthermore, the Islamic scholars sought to grasp the totality of knowledge, to systematize it, and to reach a level, as we said, of demonstrative truth. They specifically embraced the legacy of Greek philosophy, and they saw themselves as the heirs of this legacy. Now, they divided, this is just kind of bringing that point out. In their view, there were three types of knowledge. The highest form of knowledge that they themselves sought was demonstrative truth, or burhan. This is what the philosophers claimed to be seeking. On the other hand, they said that the theologians, or the mutakallimun, the Kalam scholars, the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazilis, they simply engaged in dialectical argument, that is basically polemical debate, scoring points against your opponents. And then kind of even lower than that is rhetorical arguments. This is what the common masses engage in. So demonstrative truth is basically establishing truth as scientifically true in their worldview. On the other hand, dialectical argument is simply where you say, both I and my opponent agree on certain premises, whether or not those premises are true or not. Since we both agree with them, we can work with that and go from there. This, for example, you see a lot in Sunni Shia debates, right? We talked about this, where they find a shared space that we both agree on certain texts, and we can work with those and arrive at a conclusion. This, in the view of the Islamic philosophers, would be a dialectical, polemical argument, not reaching the level of demonstrative truth. Rhetorical arguments are just what the common masses do. Basically, this is preaching to the choir. You're making these arguments, nobody is checking you, there's no debate going on, really. This is kind of, this is why I was critical of this kind of Zakir Naik kind of debating, because I think it really goes to this rhetorical level. Some quick terms that we're going to define before we move on. So philosophy technically means the love of wisdom. Historically, philosophy encompassed all bodies of knowledge. So today we think of philosophy as just kind of sitting around thinking about the meaning of life, etc. But in the past, it included natural philosophy, which referred to astronomy, medicine, and physics. It referred to all systematic bodies of knowledge. It's only later on that these other branches became so specialized that they broke off, and this is very much in the modern period, that these other branches basically became so specialized that if you wanted to pursue them, you just had to do that sub-pursuit. So that's why they broke off and became their own thing, aside from philosophy. But that is very much a modern phenomenon. Now let's talk about science. Historically, science was a general term used for any systematic body of knowledge, right? That's why we have the word in Arabic is ilm, and we use it for the religious sciences, right? That's not science how we think of it today in common usage, where today we use it to specifically refer to the natural sciences, like chemistry, biology, etc. But that's not how it was used historically. Now, let's talk about the term falsafa. This is the Arabic term for philosophy. Here, I'm going to kind of flip this around on you. At that time, falsafa did not refer to just philosophy in the general sense that we take it today, but rather it referred to a specific discipline and a specific group of thinkers, the falasifa. That is, the Aristotelian thinkers. So this is important to clarify, because we often think, for example, next class, we're going to talk about Imam Ghazali's attack on philosophy. And so it's very popular to say that Imam Ghazali supposedly killed philosophy in the Islamic world. But Ghazali himself was a philosopher by today's standards. When we read many of the texts that he is putting out there, they're clearly philosophical texts. In fact, a lot of what the theologians are engaging in is philosophy. Similarly, what the falasifa, that is the Islamic philosophers, are engaging in is what we would consider today theology. So there is this fuzzy line between theology and philosophy. So that's why it's important to be clear about our terms. Now we use philosophy as this kind of general thing that people do, and it's only referred to a specific type of general pursuit, right? It doesn't refer to the hard sciences, for example. And back then, when they were talking about philosophy, they talked about all types of knowledge. But the word falsafa referred to a specific type of this kind of project. Okay, so that's important to clarify. Before I move on, I can take a question. Muratib, go ahead, please, if you want to unmute yourself. You do have to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question for asking in this scenario about difference between Islamic philosophers and the Muslim philosophers. The same thing is an Islamic scientist and the Muslim scientist. Why we are calling them Islamic philosophers? Were their all interpretation and philosophy derived from Quran or the roots of Islam, or they were just a secular type of Muslim who took everything from external philosophies, and they should be called as the Muslim philosophers or Muslim scientists rather than Islamic? How do you take on it?
Great, that's an excellent question, and that tees us up very well. It might even be the next. Thank you. It's like you read my mind. So the very next slide is to answer this question. So I put Islamic philosophy ? Now, before I answer your question, which is this Islamic philosophy or is this just Muslim philosophy? I would point out that Islamic philosophers held an inclusivist or pluralistic approach to religion and philosophy. We will see why that is the case. Jews and Christians as monotheists also participated in this philosophical and scientific endeavor. On the other hand, there was this idea that you really should be a monotheist in order to engage in this philosophical and scientific project. So while we might be tempted to say this has no religious aspect to it whatsoever, that's not quite true. I would argue that it would probably be wrong to conclude that this was a secular endeavor, at least if we're using it in the current sense. The Islamic philosophers, at least in their view, took their Islamic beliefs very seriously. And this philosophy was an expression of that Islamic piety. What I would say is this: you may not believe, there's two ways of using the word Islamic. One is the academic sense of using the word, and the other is a confessional way of using the word. And if you could, Muratib, do you mind muting yourself, please? Sorry. After you ask the question, sorry. Thank you so much. From an academic perspective, I think it's impossible for me to say that this is not Islamic philosophy. The reason is that the actors themselves, these philosophers, view it as an Islamic or religious project. All right, they do have this inclusivist or pluralistic approach, but they are coming from their, as you can say, their Islamicity. On the other hand, whether you think it's Islamic or not, that's up to you to decide from a confessional standpoint. One Muslim might think that it is Islamic and consistent with Islam as, you know, this metaphysical concept out there, whereas another person might say this is not only not Islamic, it's completely un-Islamic or anti-Islamic. So that decision I really leave up to you. Right now, what I would ask you to do is to just keep an open mind. Let's hold off coming to a conclusion on this until, I would say, even the end of next class. Now, of course, they did take from ancient Greek philosophy. So we need to talk about ancient Greek philosophy. It started in Ionia, which is in modern day Turkey, which is interesting. Today, when the West conceptualizes its history, if you're reading a textbook on American history, for example, they will often actually start in ancient Greece because they're trying to claim the legacy of ancient Greece. But historically speaking, the connection between Greece and Egypt was much stronger than the connection between Greece and the Latin West. I mean, they were much closer physically. They might be on separate continents, but they're connected. They're both in that Mediterranean area. And there was this knowledge, sorry, if we could just mute that, please. All right. So there was this, sorry, can you please mute that? Thank you. All right. So there was this connection between ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. In fact, some of the very early Greek philosophers, it is said, traveled to Egypt and consolidated the knowledge from there, and they may have done it from other places as well. Now, what's so special about these ancient Greek philosophers? Well, if you've studied them, I think you would be impressed. All the way back then, they started looking at the world around them and tried to understand it in a systematic manner. On my view, their theories were daring, profound, and impressive. Just to give you one example, Democritus, he formulated the atomic theory of the universe. Whether or not that's true or not is another point, but is another question altogether. But the point here is that it is quite profound that they're having these kind of ideas all the way back then in 370 BC. They not only thought about natural science, but also philosophy in its widest sense. Again, we talked about it's every field of human knowledge. They were answering questions about what it means to be human, how to live as an individual and in a society, and how do we attain ultimate felicity or happiness. These are all questions that the ancient Greeks are grappling with. Here's a map where we see Ionia, which is in modern day Turkey. Now, there were three philosophers that you can kind of think are the dawns of Greek philosophy. I'm sure you've heard of them. It's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, Socrates is the most famous philosopher that we know of who doesn't have any extant writings that we can actually go to. He, however, is captured in the writings of his student, Plato, who wrote plays and often included Socrates as one of the characters. And Plato had a student, Aristotle, who, let's be, he is the most famous philosopher ever. If you had to ask who was the most famous philosopher, there is no question about it. It is Aristotle. That is the only right answer. There's no two ways about it. Now, Plato and Aristotle represent two trends in philosophy. If you've studied anything about Enlightenment thought, you know that there was this kind of interplay or battle between rationalist philosophy and empiricism. Rationalism is the idea, well, let's start with empiricism. Empiricism is a little bit more intuitive. Empiricism is the idea that we look at the world around us. We see the objects that exist in this world, and then we use those to make, we use the process of induction to arrive at certain conclusions. So for example, if we're thinking about the idea of God, we would look around us and we would see the beauty and wisdom in the creation around us. And that would help us come to the idea that there's probably a creator that created all of this. That's kind of an empiricist approach to arriving at the idea of a deity. On the other hand, there's rationalism, where you are actually more skeptical of your sense perception. You know that just what you perceive using your eyes, for example, it may be deceiving. So for example, the sun may look very small to you, but in reality, we know that the sun is very large. So that's why there's this kind of idea that no, we should first start with ideas within our head and then use the process of deduction to arrive at conclusions. So there's this kind of bottom-up approach in empiricism, and there's this top-down approach in rationalism. So these two trends start with Plato and Aristotle. Now, what's interesting, you're probably wondering, why in the heck are we, it's a class on Islamic intellectual history, why are we talking about Plato Aristotle, Socrates? Well, first of all, it seems there is evidence, at least, that all three might have been monotheists. Socrates, for example, he identifies the ideal of the good as the singular source of all good things in the universe. And one of the main charges brought up against him, for which he was eventually put to death, was that he was inciting the youth to disbelieve in the Greek pantheon, that is, their Greek gods. So there is this idea that there was a god beside the gods. They had their kind of personal, like, pantheon of gods, but these philosophers seem to be disbelieving in that pantheon as being kind of mythical, not realistic, and they're believing in this thing outside of the universe. Plato, for example, believed that God, capital G God, is transcendent, the highest, most perfect being, and is the demiurge who fashions the universe. That is, he basically, that's what it means. It means to fashion the universe or create the universe out of materials. Aristotle, meanwhile, speaks of a primary mover or unmoved mover. He comes to the conclusion that this universe can't just exist by itself. There must be this primary mover who kind of starts the whole process along. We'll see that this idea is very prevalent in the Abrahamic faith traditions, including in Islam. This is the idea that Ghazali, for example, will take up in the Kalam cosmological argument. And we briefly talked about that last class. And so Aristotle believed that this primary mover imbues all things with order and purpose, is wholly immaterial, eternal, and perfect. This is not terribly different than the idea of the monotheistic God of Islam. And this is why the Islamic philosophers, and even the mutakallimun, the Kalam scholars, will be impressed with some ideas that are coming from the Greeks. And Aristotle, based on his law of non-contradiction, realized that these Greek gods, these mythological Greek gods, don't really make much sense because they all contradict one another. In this ancient Greek view, they're trying to make sense of the world. And they want to go away from saying, this God controls the rain, this God controls the seas, this God. No, they're trying to systematize the world. And in that sense, one God who controls all the laws of nature seems to make a lot more sense and makes it easier to systematize knowledge. Now, so we've talked about those three Greek philosophers. There's one more gentleman that we need to speak about, which is Plotinus, who has a name very similar to Plato, which is confusing, but he was a Hellenistic philosopher in Roman Egypt. And what he did was, remember, we talked about these two strands of philosophy, one coming from Aristotle, the other coming from Plato. So Plotinus reinterprets Platonic thought in the 3rd century CE. And that reinterpretation is called Neoplatonism. It's just new Platonic thought. Why is Neoplatonism important? It's important because it will profoundly influence the Abrahamic faith traditions, including Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thoughts. The Islamic world, meanwhile, will receive not just Neoplatonic thought, but also Aristotelian thought. So the West doesn't really get that Aristotelian strand of thought as much, and they really get that Neoplatonism. But the Islamic world will receive both. And it's actually through the Arab and the Islamic world that the West will recover this Aristotelian thought. And that's what sparks, one of the things that sparks the European Renaissance and their Enlightenment. So let's talk about Plotinus. This is that figure that we said that that's the figure through which the Abrahamic world will receive this Greek thought primarily. So Plotinus argued that there is this one, that is, the one, who is totally transcendent, containing no division or multiplicity, and is the source of the entire universe. It is pure goodness and pure power. And this one, as we see in the diagram, will emanate these other things from itself. That is, the entire universe. It emanates from itself. Think about the sun. You can think of the one as the sun. Just as the sun emanates sun rays out from itself, similarly, this one emanates things from itself. The first thing that it emanates is what's called the divine mind. The divine mind, or nous, or logos, or even reason, that's different ways you can translate it, is associated with will and the design of the universe. So that's interesting. The one is different than the divine mind. And then the divine mind will then emanate, and from it comes the world soul. And the world soul is what creates our individual human souls. And then from there, there's a further emanation, and that's where matter is created. Basically, so you have this emanation, this downstream process. You have first the one, which emanates the divine mind, then the world soul. That's where souls come from. And then after that, you have the universe and matter. And matter is what we see in the world around us. That's our physical bodies, this table, this laptop. This is the kind of process. But all of it is being started by the one. Very confusing, I know. You're probably wondering, why in the heck are we studying this? We'll see why it's relevant. You can't understand Islamic philosophy unless you first understand this. Now, the top image that we're looking at is the one I just showed you, where the one is emanating these different things. This is mirrored in the way we see it, which is on the bottom. This is the perceivable world. This is how it looks to us. We're in the center, we're composed of matter, and then we see around us the universe, and then around that is the world soul and the divine mind, and God, or the one, is kind of the furthest out from us. And that's how we envision things. This is consistent with how the pre-modern world looked at the universe. They had a geocentric view of the universe. That is, the Earth is at the center, and the moon and the sun orbit the Earth, right? The Earth is surrounded by water, by the way, then air, then you have the moon, then you have the sun, then you have the planets, and then finally you have the stars. And the stars, by the way, they don't really think that the stars and the heavenly objects as such are things that you can actually travel to. Like they don't think that you can take a rocket ship and travel to them like you can travel to different parts of the Earth. They're actually thinking of the world, the universe underneath the moon. They call it the sublunar world. That's our world. That's the universe that we exist in. Whereas the heavenly world is everything beyond the moon. And that's something that you can't really travel to or touch. That's kind of the celestial sphere. That's where these divine kind of objects are. And that's where, beyond that, is where you see the one that we talked about. So here's a medieval kind of, or sorry, the pre-modern or ancient view of the world. You have the Earth at the center, and then you have the different planets, and then the stars, etc. It's getting very confusing, I know. This is the same concept here. Basically, the one creates the divine mind, it emanates the divine mind, and then it emanates the world soul. And then beyond that, it emanates the universe. And the universe consists of the stars, the humans, the animals, the fish, insects, plants, rocks, everything that we see in this world. This is what's called the great chain of being. You basically see this thing where you're going from the stars, which are considered more complex or divine, things that are less complex, humans, animals, fish, insects, plants, and rocks. And in fact, this is the idea that will kind of influence a little bit Charles Darwin when he kind of thinks about how creatures kind of evolve from one to the other. But that's much later, of course. Now you're probably kind of chuckling to yourself, at least I did when I read all this stuff. It really looks like a bunch of nonsense, right? Well, I would hold off the skepticism a little bit, because you should keep in mind that within this worldview, the ancient Greeks advanced in major areas of scientific learning, probably all the major scientific areas of learning, including anatomy, astronomy, biology, geometry, mathematics, medicine, physics, you name it. Euclidean geometry, for example, was a mathematical system that stood for over 2,000 years. The Ptolemaic system, which is dealing with astronomy, was an incredibly accurate predictive model for astronomical calculations, despite being technically wrong, right? It was geocentric. And yet the Ptolemaic system was able to do incredibly accurate predictions of the heavenly bodies. Furthermore, Greek philosophy, what is it trying to do? As weird as this looks to us, what they're trying to do is create a systematic theory of everything. That is, understanding everything in the most expansive way possible, thereby bringing all knowledge under its ambit. So it's a very ambitious project. And Aristotelian science is something that they are able to observe and analyze pretty much everything in our universe. In this Aristotelian science, the objects of the world are thought to consist of intrinsic natural tendencies. For example, we have a rock. A rock is composed of earth, and earth, in their view, has a natural tendency to want to move down to the center of the universe, that is, down to the earth. So a rock will naturally, because of the nature of its element, that is, earth, will naturally want to fall down. That's why when you take a rock and you drop it, it falls down to the earth. And it will do so unless it's prevented to do so by another force. So for example, if I drop a rock right here, it's my table that will stop it from falling to the floor. Otherwise, it would have gone down to the earth. So they had this idea that everything on earth, that is all the physical things on this earth, are composed of two things. One is matter and two is form. Matter is the thing that something is made up of. So for example, this table is composed of wood, and the form is the form of the table. We take the wood and we shape it into the form of a table. What you're getting is a scientific way of viewing the world. And that's really what they were doing. Based on this, they were able to argue, Aristotle did, that there are four causes of everything. This is very different than the way we view things today. But there's, in their view, the material cause of a thing. Again, that's the wood that the table is made out of. That's the material it's made out of, the material cause. Then there's the formal cause. That's the form that the table takes. So we take the wood and we shape it into the form of a table. Okay, that makes sense. We got matter, we got form. Then there's the efficient cause. That's actually what you and I nowadays think about a cause, right? You have somebody who makes a table maker. That's the human being who actually makes the table. That's the efficient cause. That's what takes the matter and makes it into the form. So that's the efficient cause. And then finally, you have the final cause. This is very different than the way we view things today in the modern world. The final cause is what that object is intended for. What's the goal of that object? In this case, it's a table. It's something that we eat on, that we use to write on. That's the final cause. So in this Aristotelian view of the universe, the things in the universe are goal-oriented. This is what we call a teleological view of the universe, very different than our modern day conception. Now, this is all very good, but why in the heck am I talking about all this stuff, right? Well, I want to say that we need to understand that there were, in history, at least three different scientific worldviews. The first one was the Aristotelian worldview that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, from 300 BCE to 1600 BCE. 1600 CE. This was a teleological or goal-oriented view of the world. It was based on the Ptolemaic system, which is the geocentric view of the universe. That is, the earth is at the center. And this view, this worldview, what is a worldview, by the way? A worldview is not just various scientific facts. It's how you put all those scientific facts together in a puzzle. That puzzle is your worldview. The different pieces of that puzzle are interlocking with each other in a systematic way. That's what a worldview is. Your worldview actually makes sense of all those puzzles so that you can look back at it and see a picture of the universe. And in this picture of the universe, this Aristotelian picture, the universe looks like an organism. It's a living, breathing thing. In the 16th century, Isaac Newton is going to change things. Now, by the way, these worldviews are based on their kind of eponymous founders, but that doesn't just mean that Isaac Newton is the only single one who changed everything. He's the one who basically did kind of something very influential, but there were many other scientists that were also involved, of course, as we see Copernicus and Kepler. So in the 16th century, things start to change. We start to view the world as more mechanistic in nature, as forces acting on matter. This Newtonian worldview is what many of you, at least this is what I studied in high school when I studied physics. This was forces acting on objects. F equals ma, if you remember. That is, if I drop a rock, there's a force of gravity that acts on that rock and causes it to fall to the ground. So the Aristotelian worldview, the rock has this innate nature, which will cause it to seek the ground. In the Newtonian worldview, it's not the rock that seeks to fall to the ground, but rather another force that's acting on the rock. And the rock will fall to the ground unless there's another force that's acting on it in another direction. So in this worldview, well, first of all, instead of the Ptolemaic system, which is geocentric, now there's this shift to the heliocentric view of the universe. That is, the sun is at the center of the universe and the earth orbits it. So that's dramatically different. In this worldview, the universe is seen like a machine. It's just a bunch of parts that are moving like a clock. Now, the Newtonian worldview is what you and I are most familiar with, but things started to change again in the 20th century with Albert Einstein, and then with the developments of special relativity and quantum mechanics. This stuff is extremely confusing. It causes me to be extremely perplexed. I was, for example, very shocked, embarrassingly, very recently, when I realized that gravity doesn't really exist in the way that we think it does. And that's due to these kind of theories of special relativity, and then quantum mechanics changes things even more. This is very counterintuitive to the way that we view the world, which is very still Newtonian, at least amongst the common masses. Now, why am I talking about these worldviews? The reason is we're going to be steeping ourselves in this Aristotelian worldview. And our tendency is going to be to kind of think this is weird, strange, odd. Why in the heck are Muslims taking this seriously? But keep in mind that just like we take the Newtonian worldview seriously, they're taking this Aristotelian worldview seriously, and they're actually making a lot of scientific progress, even though their worldview may be technically wrong according to what we now think. As we said, the Ptolemaic system was able to make very accurate predictions of the heavenly bodies, the stars, or they were able to predict eclipses, for example, very accurately, even though they had an Earth-centric view of the world. So just because your worldview is technically wrong, it doesn't mean that you can't still advance the scientific endeavor. Similarly, the Newtonian worldview is very accurate as far as judging physics, objects. And, we did these calculations when we were in high school, and they're pretty accurate. So, or for the most part, at least. I'm sure a scientist here is going to be cringing when I'm talking. My friend Maz is probably cringing right now. But the point here is that don't just discard these worldviews because they seem strange to you. Our worldview today might seem strange 1,000 years from now when we find out that our world is just a simulation from the planet Morgon, right? They're going to laugh at us that we thought of our current worldview. So that doesn't mean that that is completely useless. Furthermore, I think it behooves us to remember that Aristotelian science at that time was just science. Euclidean geometry was not called Euclidean geometry, it was just geometry. Galenic medicine was just medicine, and Ptolemaic astronomy was just astronomy. So when we view these things today, our kind of gut reaction is to say, why in the heck are these Muslims embracing this Aristotelian science, this Western Greek science? But really, it wasn't in their conception Greek science as such. It was just science. In the same way that today, you and I view science and we accept it, right? We're trying to reconcile our religion with modern science, right? 1,000 years from now, when the people know that it's just a simulation on the planet Morgon, they're going to look at us and say, why did the Muslims then are going to look at us and say, why did they take Western science and take it so seriously? That's kind of kufr. Why are they doing that? Well, I think that would be a very simplistic way of looking at things, right? This is the worldview that's dominant at that time. This is science at that time. And if they don't reconcile religion with science, I think it's going to cause many people to disbelieve in religion altogether. At least that was their view back then. And that's honestly our view today, right? That's why we have all these conferences on reconciling Islam with science, reconciling Islam with evolution, etc. That's why we're struggling with this issue today. We think it's important. Similarly, they thought it was important back then. So again, this is what the philosophers were trying to do. They were trying to reconcile religion and science. And again, science back then was just philosophy. Philosophy included the natural sciences. They were also Islamicizing this knowledge. That is, they were fitting the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic worldview into an Islamic framework. Now, you might personally think that they basically bent Islam too much and reconciled things too much, and therefore it wasn't really Islamic. That's your personal view that you're free to take. But in their mind, they're definitely trying to Islamicize this knowledge. Just like we today, for example, you'll see many Muslims say the Big Bang theory is consistent with the Quranic theory of creation. What is that? That's Islamicizing the scientific theory that we have today. There is a difference, however. When the Islamic philosophers were doing it, this project of reconciliation that they were doing, it was actually not as apologetic as the one that you and I, that we today are often engaged in. That is because the Islamic philosophers were doing it from a position of confidence and power. That is, they thought they were the greatest civilization at that time. And they had a desire to take command of the whole edifice of human wisdom and advance it as they saw themselves as the torchbearers of collective human knowledge. That is, they weren't just doing these kind of conferences to kind of justify to themselves they're seeing that their youth are leaving Islam. No, they were actually trying to grab this knowledge and kind of advance it forward. The Abbasids, for example, were claiming not to take wisdom from the Greeks, but in fact to take it back from the Greeks and to even understand it better than the Greeks themselves. All right, this I think is a good time to take questions. Do we have any, or should I move on? Let's see here. I think, all right, so we have not a debate, but a discussion going on about why people leave Islam today. I think it's true to say that the conflict between religion and science is one of them. There are, of course, many different reasons people leave. I'm actually going to address this later on in this class. So let's move on. All right, so this is the project. It starts in Baghdad, and you have these Baghdad translation circles. The Khalif al-Mansur is one of the ones who kicked this off, this translation project. And we again said that this translation project is a lot more than translation, right? They're writing commentaries upon the translations and commentaries upon the commentaries. And the commentaries are building upon knowledge. They're not just repeating what's in the translation. And again, when the West is going to absorb these translations, they're going to take with them the commentaries. And so there's this progressive building of human knowledge. Now, you might have seen that kind of coffee table book on kind of 1001 Islamic inventions or something along those lines. One of the reasons why scholars are a little bit skeptical of those kind of books is because they kind of view the scientific endeavor as just like inventions. And then there's always one guy who invents something. That's not really how historians of science see things. Instead, there's this kind of gradual building up of knowledge. When you invent something, you're not the one who just comes up with it out of the blue. You're actually just making these kind of minuscule improvements on past knowledge. And that's really what is going on here. But clearly, the Islamic scientists, the philosophers, they advance the scientific endeavor greatly. And anyone who underestimates that, I think, is mistaken and probably has ulterior motives. So in any case, so Muslims in this translation project, they get hold of these precious texts, blow off the dust, and start a cultural renaissance that could rival, in Peter Adamson's words, the goings on in Europe in the 15th century, that is the Renaissance. Khalifa al-Ma'mun, as we saw, founded the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, and throughout early Islamic history, this is a sore spot for me, by the way, the ruling elites patronized Islamic philosophers, generously funding their research work. I think this is something that we in the modern world, Muslims, we donate all sorts of money to charity, but do we really fund our Islamic institutions? Do we have think tanks? I think this is something that we really lag behind in. We wonder why there's nobody talking about, these topics, and yet we're not willing to fund them. So I think this is a sore subject. I'd love to quit my day job or my night job as a physician and just focus on my scholarly work, but I can just only hope. But at this time, there are people who are able to dedicate themselves to this philosophical scientific enterprise because of their patronage from the ruling elite. Now, it should be kept in mind that many of the early translators were Christians who read Syriac. They were the ones who spoke Syriac. And so from the very inception, this philosophical and scientific enterprise is multi-confessional. Now, they would debate each other. So it's not the case that the Islamic philosophers did not see themselves as Muslims. They very much did. And you'll see that they did have friendly debates, more or less, with their Christian philosophers. But that didn't mean that they couldn't also engage in joint philosophical and scientific projects. On that note, let's look at the first kind of Islamic philosopher that we think about. His name was Al-Kindi. He's known as the father of Arab philosophy, or the philosopher of the Arabs. He supervised a translation circle in Baghdad. And he showed this intellectual openness to outside knowledge. He said, the truth is the truth, no matter what its source might be. And we see in that quote, we should not be ashamed to acknowledge truth from whatever source it comes to us, even if it is brought to us by former generations and foreign peoples. For him who seeks the truth, there is nothing of higher value than truth itself. This is that kind of intellectual openness. And now clearly they're responding to people more on the right of them Islamically, the religious conservatives, especially the Hanbali scholars that we discussed in last lecture, who are critical of this kind of taking from the Greek tradition. They're seeing that as kind of kufr. We can just focus on the Quran and the Hadith. Why are you looking at these outside sources for knowledge? But these Islamic philosophers are taking a more broad-minded approach, whether you agree with that or not, but clearly they are. Here's another Islamic philosopher that we're not going to talk about this lecture. We're going to talk about next time. He's very famous. His name is Ibn Rushd. He's known in the West as Averroes. So we'll see that actually many of these Islamic philosophers, their work is taken up in the West. And so they have these kind of these anglicized names. And he also, the reason why I'm bringing up just today is just because he has some famous quotes about this kind of intellectual openness. So he says, quote, truth does not oppose truth, regardless of whether this other one, that is the one you take the knowledge from, shares our religion or not. Now, it wasn't this mindless aping of this knowledge. He did say that Muslims should eagerly lay hands on these books, these outside books, but they should only accept what is correct in them. And if there's anything incorrect in them, we should draw attention to that and correct those errors that people are making. I do have a great question, which is from Sadia about, I wonder what role women played in this period of scholarship. Were they not engaged, or if so, were they not projected? I think by that you mean, were they not recorded in history? I think this was very much an elite project, and due to its elitism, as far as we can see in the historical record, as far as I know, it was very much a man-centric project, unfortunately. So a chapter on women Islamic philosophers would be extremely thin. This is different than the Sufi tradition, as we've seen, where there were these women mystics. And some of them were engaging in types of philosophy, these women women mystics. And we did see that in the lecture on Sufism. All right. All right. So I'll come back to questions shortly. Let's go back to Al-Kindi. So I just quoted Ibn Rushd to show this intellectual openness. Al-Kindi's translation circles, they, again, they're being selective. They are taking from the Greeks, but they're editing and quote unquote correcting these texts as well to line them up with proper Islamic or Abrahamic belief. So there was this text, this Theology of Aristotle, which by the way, wasn't really written by Aristotle, but the Islamic philosophers, and even the Mutakallimun, the Kalam scholars, everybody in the Islamic world, other than the Hanbalis, of course, they loved Aristotle. In fact, by the way, many Muslims in history have thought that Aristotle, maybe even Socrates and Plato, were unnamed prophets of God. As we know, in the tradition, there were these 124,000 prophets. Not all of them were named in our sources. And so some of them even see them as prophets because of the fact that they were possibly monotheistic. Now, anyways, they are correcting these texts or editing these texts in their view. So for example, we had this emanation theory, right? Where we had the one emanating the divine mind, and from there, the world, soul, the universe, and matter. In our view, that's kind of strange, right? Why is the divine mind different than the one? So in their translation, in Al-Kindi's circle, they're actually going to unify the divine mind with the one. So the divine mind and the one are going to be one thing, and that is the Abrahamic God. That represents Allah. And that is what emanates everything else, which is the one, and it is the divine mind itself. And the word used for this divine mind is akal, which we've talked about before, which is reason. So they think that God is himself reason. That's how much philosophers favor or think highly of human reason. We saw how the Hanbalis have this kind of pessimistic view towards human reason, but the Islamic philosophers equate it with God himself. And that is because God cannot be, in their view, God cannot be a body. He cannot consist of parts, a face, eyes, hands, legs. We saw that's what the Hanbali view kind of was. They might deny that they say that he has a body, but clearly they have this kind of more anthropomorphic view of God. But if God is going to be the creator of the universe, he can't be a body in that universe. So he has to be a non-body. And what's the only thing that can be a non-body? Well, it's a mind. And so God is a divine mind. And that's the view that the Islamic philosophers are going to take, and really what the Islamic theologians themselves also take. All right. Now, similarly, if the Islamic philosophers were kind of quote unquote correcting these texts to, verify the idea of the Abrahamic God, similarly, they were taking on this Greek philosophy to defend and justify the idea of the soul. Why is the soul so important? Well, we all know that the soul is important to the religious conceptions. And it's also important for the idea of the immortality of the soul after your body dies, right? After you die, your soul lives on in the hereafter. Well, that's why these Islamic philosophers are trying to justify this idea in the scientific worldview that existed at that time, which was that Aristotelian / Neoplatonic worldview. So he believes, Al-Kindi believes, that these Greek ideas, which again are just scientific ideas, for them, those are their modern ideas, their modern scientific worldview of that time, can provide support and explication for Muslim beliefs, ranging from the oneness of God to the immortality of the soul. Al-Kindi was, according to Peter Adamson, a devout Muslim. For him, first philosophy should study the first cause, which is, of course, God. Now, Al-Kindi similarly wants to argue against the view that the universe is eternal, which is interesting, right? Because we'll see how Ghazali will take the philosophers to task for their belief that the universe is eternal. But Al-Kindi here is actually arguing against Aristotle's idea that the universe is eternal. Why is Al-Kindi doing this? Al-Kindi is doing this because if the universe is eternal, then maybe the universe existed forever. Well, it did, right? It's eternal, and therefore did not need a creator. So historically speaking, most theologians are wanting to argue that the universe is temporal, whereas many atheistic materialists want to argue the exact opposite, that the universe is eternal. So Al-Kindi is going to fight back against this view. He is going to believe that, like Ghazali some centuries later, that this idea of the eternity of the universe is going to threaten the belief in God. Now, he's going to correct Aristotle without actually pointing out that Aristotle held the view that the universe is eternal, right? He doesn't want to put that accusation on Aristotle. But Al-Kindi does use philosophical arguments inspired by John the Grammarian, a Christian, against an infinite regress, which becomes what's later called the Kalam cosmological argument, which the theologians will call the mother of all proofs for the existence of God. We talked about this last class. Now, let's try to understand this Kalam cosmological argument. I gave you some resources last time, but I actually do want to go into the two main arguments in the Islamic tradition for the existence of God. It's quite complicated, so I'm going to use something we all love, samosas. I realized that not everybody might know what samosas are. We're only 99% all Pakistani today, so let's explain what samosas are. These are what samosas are. They are a delicious treat, right, that we're all going to eat in iftar very shortly. So let's try to understand the Kalam cosmological argument through samosas. So imagine that Shazia auntie has a samosa shop. Samosas are us. And she will open her shop up as soon as she counts all of the samosas that her husband, Habib uncle, is making. I actually thought about this. I didn't want to make it, I was corrected on the gendered language. So here, Shazia auntie is the owner of the samosa shop, and her husband, Habib uncle, is the one making them, okay? So her husband, Habib uncle, is making samosas, and as soon as Habib uncle is done making the samosas and Shazia auntie counts them, they're going to open up the shop, and then we're all going to get samosas and eat them. But Habib uncle really likes samosas, so he's going to make an infinite number of samosas. Yummy, we can't wait to eat them. But if Shazia auntie has to count an infinite number of samosas, will she ever be able to open up the samosa shop? More importantly, will we ever be able to eat samosas? This is the idea of the Kalam cosmological argument. With this, let's actually look at how a modern Western scholar, he's Christian, he's a Christian theologian, William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig has popularized this idea of the Kalam cosmological argument in the modern day. He's resuscitated it. Let's see how he formulates this Kalam cosmological argument, which is considered kind of the mother of all proofs for the Islamic theologians in Islamic history.
Of the subsets of these arguments. What were some of the arguments for the beginning of the universe? Well, let's let one of the greatest medieval champions of the doctrine of creation.
Let me slow that down. Again, I like to listen to things really fast. And then we'll take questions and go for a break.
Speak for himself. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran. And he was concerned that Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by Greek philosophy to deny the beginning of the universe. They held that the universe flows necessarily out of God and is therefore beginningless. After thoroughly studying the teachings of these philosophers, Al-Ghazali wrote a devastating critique of their views called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And in this fascinating book, he argues that it is impossible that the universe be beginningless. The universe must have a beginning, he argues, and since nothing begins to exist without a cause, there must therefore be a transcendent creator of the universe. Ghazali frames his argument very simply. Let me quote him. He says, every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now, the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. And we can summarize Ghazali's reasoning in three simple steps. One, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. This argument is so marvelously simple that it's easy to memorize and share with another person. Moreover, this is a logically airtight argument. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion follows necessarily. So I'd like to look at this argument with you this morning more closely, starting with the second premise, that the universe began to exist. During the Middle Ages, before the rise of modern science, people had no scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. But Ghazali presented some ingenious philosophical arguments for why the past has to be finite. For example, Ghazali points out that if the universe never began to exist, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. Think about it.
So that's the samosa example, right? If Habib Uncle keeps having to make samosas, that shop will never open up.
If the universe never began to exist, then the number of past events is infinite. But, Al-Ghazali argued, this is impossible because an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
So now, of course, this argument itself, just this part of it, does not get you all the way to the Abrahamic concept of God. Somebody could say, okay, fine, you're saying that something had to create the universe. Couldn't that have been a black hole? Couldn't that have been the very popular nowadays is the flying spaghetti monster? This doesn't get you to God. But the Islamic theologians and philosophers are much more sophisticated than that. They are actually going to take this argument further and then argue what that necessary cause, what the attributes of that necessary cause must be in order to be that creator of the effect. And those attributes, when you put them together, they come close to the idea of the Abrahamic conception of God. Now, of course, this argument rests on the second premise, which is that the universe is not eternal. That's why Al-Kindi, by the way, it's Al-Kindi who actually comes up with this theory, not Ghazali. Ghazali actually will just formulate it in its kind of most sophisticated and thorough manner, and he deserves credit for that. But Al-Kindi, like many of the ideas we're going to see today, is kind of the originator of these many of these ideas. And but that's why they have to defend this idea that the universe is not eternal. Having said that, many of the Islamic philosophers that are going to follow are actually going to accept the idea that the universe is most likely eternal. And the reason for that is that, well, we're going to talk about that later. And that's why they didn't see this Kalam cosmological argument as too terribly strong. Now, nowadays, the Kalam cosmological argument is very popular because it used to be in the 19th century that scientists and thinkers of the world thought that the universe is eternal. But then evidence started coming around, scientific evidence, that our universe is not eternal. One of these things is the law of thermodynamics. Basically, there's a certain amount of energy in the universe, and that is, based on this, as well as the idea that the universe is expanding. And the fact that it's expanding means that if the universe was eternal, the universe would have expanded so much that it would no longer exist the way it does today. I might have not done this quite scientific justice. I'm not a scientist in that sense. But the point is that there is scientific evidence that has resuscitated this Kalam cosmological argument, which is why William Lane Craig likes it so much. Having said that, it might not be the best idea to base your entire faith on a scientific idea that might change, right? We now have this idea of multiverses, which may or may not threaten this second premise. And that's why there's going to be another argument that Ibn Sina, Avicenna, is going to raise, that we're going to talk about after the break, that actually is probably more powerful, at least in my view. But I do find the Kalam cosmological argument very strong. Now, before we go to the break, we have just a couple more slides. So it's going to get even weirder now. So in Al-Kindi's model of the universe, as with the Ptolemaic system he is borrowing, getting all of this science from, this ideas from, God, or the One, does not directly act on the world. Instead, he influences the celestial bodies, the heavenly bodies. Those are the stars that you're looking at. He influences the celestial bodies, which then have downstream effects in the perceivable world. So there's this kind of idea linked to astrology somewhat, but it's really this kind of scientific idea of the time that the movements of the celestial bodies affect events on the grounds. Now, this seems quite problematic, right? After all, the theologians, the Kalam scholars like the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris, they conceived of a God that's much more hands-on, seeing him, that is God, as the direct cause for all created things and events in our world. The Mu'tazilis would exclude like our personal will and actions, and the Ash'aris would definitely not exclude anything. So they have a more kind of active God that has an active hand, you could say, in the universe. So we might be wanting to say that this is kind of really bad shirk that's going on. But just wait a minute. How terribly different is this idea than our saying today that God causes objects to fall to the ground using or through the force of gravity? Now, this is a really good example, actually, because I just told you earlier that we may no longer have this concept of gravity, that certain recent discoveries have questioned this idea of gravity. But we believed in it for so long, but nobody thought that this was shirk to say that God acts through this force of gravity. Well, we'll push back on that idea next week, next class, when we talk about Ghazali. But anyways, don't we view the laws of physics, at least most of us, as mediators for God's actions on Earth, even in our religious worldview? Well, in their worldview, the celestial bodies similarly exert a type of force in the sublunar world. What is the sublunar world? That's everything beyond, within the moon is the outer orbit, and that's kind of our temporal universe. Everything else is kind of the heavens. Lastly, before the break, hopefully, I think this is my last slide, we're going to talk about Al-Kindi's Muslimness. That is, was he just a person who happened to be Muslim, or was he coming from his Islamic worldview? Well, we saw that Al-Kindi, he was at pains to unify the One and the Nous to represent God, that is, the creator of everything and the divine mind. He rejected the eternity of the universe in order to posit the need for a creator. That is, the universe is not eternal, it was created, and therefore it needs a creator. This is clearly an Islamic belief that he's trying, an Islamic motivation that he has. And he even wrote something against the Christian doctrine of Trinity, and he's using Greek logic to do so. This is not too terribly different than a lot of the kind of argumentation that goes on today. And he also used Aristotelian logic to prove that the soul is immaterial. Now, we didn't get into that, but basically they're using scientific arguments of their time to argue that there is this thing called the soul, that it is immaterial, and that it lives on after death in the hereafter. So we see that Al-Kindi is motivated by all of these kind of Islamic goals in mind. I know this is very difficult, probably not as funny as I thought when I actually first saw this, but we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some even more weirder things, but we'll take a break. Before we take the break, I do want to see if anyone has any questions. Can we get a verbal question? Does anybody want to ask a verbal question? I do want to encourage those, so please don't be shy.
A catch question, kind of a comment.
Yes, please.
I wonder if you've come across or looked into Al-Kindi's. I think it may be important to note, if indeed it's accurate, Al-Kindi's sort of scholarly lineage, like Islamically, religiously, because it seems that there's a strong sort of religious inclination in his work of, going back to Jabir al-Hayyan and to Ja'far al-Sadiq and that lineage as well, that I think I find that we have not talked much about. So I wonder if you come across that discussion.
That's a great question, Imam. I actually don't know. So if you know about that, that's something that you should absolutely share with us right now, if you have some inclinations of that. So I don't know the answer to that. But that's something great to look into.
Well, there certainly is evidence that his teacher and his teacher before that, and then I think Jabir al-Hayyan is 2 teachers above him, who was a student of Ja'far al-Sadiq, who then would have been a student of his father and his father's father, going back to the Prophet. So there really is a strong, what I find a strong religious chain in all of these sort of philosophers that came about. And there's evidence of Ja'far al-Sadiq, for example, encouraging Jabir al-Hayyan to engage in these physical sciences, from chemistry and some evidence, although sparse, of having taught him in chemistry.
That's fascinating. I agree with you. Many of them, like for example, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, he was an Islamic jurist. He was a fiqh. He wrote a great text of fiqh that even if many people think his theological ideas or his philosophical ideas were completely unacceptable to them, they do take from his books of fiqh. So yes, I agree with you. I think that they are approaching this from their own Islamic piety. Whether you or I agree with it or not, that's a different story, but clearly they're coming from this position. Okay, so if we don't have any more, okay, I have one more question and then we'll go for the break, which is why did Muslims not learn the Greek language rather than translation into Arabic? I'm sure that they did try to learn Greek. I mean, we can assume that at least, but I think that's easier said than done. So I think they already had people who spoke languages. I think Syriac was a major language, and so that's why there were Christians who were involved in this. And the Christians and Jews, by the way, continued in this tradition. So it wasn't just Muslim philosophers. And that's why we could even call it philosophy in the Islamic world, where they are doing Islamic philosophy, but more of a generalized Abrahamic philosophy as well. All right, let's take a break. No eating samosas. We're not yet at iftar, at least not here. And we'll see you in 7 minutes. Thank you so much. All right, anybody know how we're doing on time? Moderator here. Has it been 7 minutes? I forgot to look at the time before I went on break.
It's been 7 minutes exactly, actually.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much.
Jawad, I have a quick question if you
sure, please.
Time. So I was thinking, we're so lucky nowadays we have Wikipedia. If I don't know anything about a Muslim philosopher, I can Google it. But for somebody, an academic like yourself, if you wanted to search up and research these philosophers, what are your sources? Did they leave books? Are there commentaries? How do you read up on them and research them?
So that's a great question. So Google is, academics still use Google. Google is a great source. The problem of Google is that you need to know what you find. And even as, you're a physician, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so you know that we physicians still use Google, right? But the difference between us and non-physicians is that when we use Google, then we know this website is garbage, this website was made by a 2-year-old, this website is made by a medical committee. So that's kind of the difference. So that's number one. Number two is there are different books that we use that are kind of textbook sort of books. I am going to reference those. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to do it for this lecture, but we're continuing with Islamic philosophy next class. At the end of the class, I will give some generalized books that I recommend. And then finally, to answer your question, yes, these philosophers left behind tons of writing. So unlike the Mu'tazilis, where a lot of their material was destroyed, there's a lot of surviving material for the Islamic philosophers. And more importantly, Western academics have been fascinated by the Islamic philosophers, especially because it's part of the Western legacy. So because of that, tons of stuff, even if you don't read Arabic, tons of stuff has been translated. So Al-Kindi's, I think all of his works have been translated by Peter Adamson. So literally you can buy these books from Amazon. Some of them can be quite expensive though. So, I mean, I use Harvard Library, and then I also have some secret websites where you can get PDFs of pretty much every book out there. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't put that on this recording, but every grad student does that. So that's how do we do it. All right. Okay, we can take one more question and then we will get started. Thank you so much. All right, Maratab, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question about relationship between Sufism or Sufis philosophers and the Islamic philosophers. Do you rate both as Islamic philosophers, or they have a different paradigm of Islamic worldview, and Islamic philosophers are particularly inspired by like Greek philosophy and other things? How do you compare both type of people?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So the term, when I'm using Islamic philosophers, I'm just using the translation of the Arabic word, the falasifa, which refers to a specific group of that time who went by that title. So unlike other words that we've been using, that group at that time actually used that title. So that's who I'm actually referring to. So when I say Islamic philosophers, I really mean the Arabic word falasifa. And so it's a specific group. It doesn't encompass everybody who did philosophy at that time. Again, Imam Ghazali, who is a Sufi as well, right? He is going to come out and attack the philosophers, the Islamic philosophers. We're going to talk about that in the next class. But he himself was doing philosophy. There is also an overlap between mysticism and philosophy. So some people even think Avicenna was a Sufi or a mystic in general. And we'll see that next class when we talk about Ibn Tufayl, who is a famous Islamic philosopher, where he was definitely mixing mysticism with this kind of philosophy. So it is an open question, and it is still a debate in the academy. But I would say, yes, there is an overlap. Thank you so much. And just please make sure to mute your mic now, please. Thanks so much. All right, let's begin now. And if you could lower your hand as well so that I know when you have another question. Thanks so much. Okay, back to samosas. All right, before we get back to samosas, I just wanted to reiterate that I know a lot of this stuff that we've talked about is kind of weird out there, but you're seeing now that at least some of it is becoming relevant to you, right? The argument for the existence of God was made by Al-Kindi. That was based on the Greek sciences that he came up with and Greek logic that he came up with this argument, and that Ghazali will take this argument. So Ghazali, even though he's going to come out against the Islamic philosophers, in fact, he's going to absorb some of that or much of that Islamic thought to such an extent that some academics even, I don't think it's correct to say it, but they do say that he is Avicennan himself. That is, he took so many of Ibn Sina's ideas, even though he was attacking Ibn Sina, that he himself was an Avicennan. So you see that there is this absorption of philosophy even by somebody as orthodox as Ghazali. So that's something that's interesting to keep in mind. So even as weird as all this stuff is, it is very critical to our thoughts. And I'm sorry, some of my things are hiding here, so I need to, all right. Okay, so let's continue. All right, we're gonna go back to samosas for another thought experiment. If I say, let's all go eat samosas. And are you seeing the right screen? You're seeing that the keynote, can somebody give me a thumbs up? Yes? Okay, good. All right. If I say, let's all go eat samosas, all of you are thinking of the same thing that I am, hopefully, a yummy samosa. Yet you don't have access to my mind, and I don't have access to yours. So how do we all come to this same idea of a samosa? This is a question that these philosophers are thinking about. And this is an idea that the pre-Islamic, the Greek philosophers were also thinking about. They were probably eating samosas in their time as well. Their theory, this Neoplatonic theory, or this Aristotelian theory was, I would say probably more Neoplatonic, but their theory was that before we had ever heard of samosas, our mind was in a state of potential knowledge. That is, at that time, we didn't know what samosas are, but we still had the potential to know about yummy samosas. So our mind at that time was at a potential state of this knowledge. And can we please make sure that everybody's muted, please? Okay, great. All right. Now, there had to be something or someone that actualizes this potential knowledge into actual knowledge. That is, our potential knowledge of a samosa to actually having knowledge of what a samosa is. And this actual knowledge of a samosa has to be shared between all of us. We all have to eat the same kind of samosa. So who or what does this actualizing? And here, by the way, is where it gets kind of weird. All right, it's not samosa man. It's this thing that's even weirder, which is the active intellect. Now there's this idea of this active intellect, which is sometimes understood as the divine mind, that is, which the Islamic philosophers will call God. But more often than not, it's an intermediary between God and us, which is symbolized by the angel Gabriel. This active intellect downloads that information, or uploads, depending on how you're looking at it. This active intellect downloads that information, the form of a samosa. So you can think of it, there's this file that's called samosa.html, and it's out there on this Google document out there. That's the active intellect's document. Now this file is being downloaded into our brains. That's the way that we all get the idea of samosa in our brain. It's weird, but this is the science of that day. They're trying to come up with a theory of knowledge. How do we have shared knowledge, and how do we reach from what they thought was potential knowledge to actual knowledge? As you can tell from the mention of the angel Gabriel, this theory will be important for their scientific theory of prophecy. What's interesting to note is that in the science of that day, there wasn't this separation between, this strict separation between theology and science as we think of it today. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. And it's also, again, a theory of knowledge acquisition taken from Aristotle and Neoplatonic thought, the science of that day, which was then understood and reinterpreted in Islamic language. That's where the idea of the angel Gabriel comes from. Sorry, is someone speaking, or can we? Okay, great. All right. Al-Kindi first formulates this Islamic concept and calls it the first intellect, but eventually in the Islamic philosopher tradition, it'll be called the active intellect. And the real credit for developing this idea goes to our next Islamic philosopher, Al-Farabi. So let's talk about Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi, he has an anglicized name. Sorry, I gotta change something around, I apologize. Okay. So Al-Farabi, he's also he's known in the West as well. That's how profound he was. He is known as the second master in the Arab Islamic tradition. Who was the first master? Well, you might think it was Al-Kindi, but it was not. The first master is Aristotle. So the first master is Aristotle, and the second master is Al-Farabi. That's how highly that these Islamic philosophers are seeing the Aristotelian and Aristotle, that tradition. Now, Al-Farabi was very prodigious. He has works in logic, mathematics, metaphysics, cosmology, human nature, ethics, and political philosophy. Moreover, he is famous because he was the systematizer of this philosophical thought. So Al-Kindi is a very unique thinker. He comes up with a lot of these ideas, but he doesn't put them all together in this kind of one working system. And Al-Farabi is the one who's going to be famous for that. He's grasping all these sciences as one interlocking system, and that's what he thinks is really important to do.
Oh, Hunter.
And he was very influential on Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, who is considered one of the greatest Islamic philosophers. So Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, he actually singles out Al-Farabi, which, if you know anything about Ibn Sina, that's pretty good, because Ibn Sina thought very highly of himself. And so to give credit to anyone was a big deal. From Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, took the vision of God as the first cause, who creates the rest of the universe by emanating it, the universe, from himself necessarily, and through a series of intermediaries. Now, let's go back to this image. Remember, the top image is how it is in reality, the one and the divine mind, that's God, and that emanates the world, soul, the universe, and then eventually those emanations create matter. That's the universe. That's what you and I see. To us, all of that is mirrored, and that's the bottom image. So we see matter, and then the universe around us, and then everything around that. And again, this is the medieval world view of the world, of the universe. And again, in that medieval science, God, or the one, acts on the world by moving the heavenly, the celestial bodies, which then influence events in the sublunar world, that is our universe where you and I act, which is everything below the moon. So we've already talked about that. I'm just reiterating it because I know that it's kind of super weird to all of us. Guess what? It gets even weirder. So Al-Farabi is going to introduce in his cosmology a bunch more intermediaries between God and us. These intermediaries, so you see in the top on the left, you see God. Then there are all of these intermediaries, these 10 intellects, these intelligences, these 10 intellects. These are actually celestial minds, you can think about it. And they are emanated from God. So the God emanates the first intellect. Then the first intellect thinks about God. And in that process, for some reason, a byproduct is created, which is the divine sphere. And then also another byproduct is the emanation of the second intellect. The second intellect does the same thing, intellects what's above it. And as a byproduct, you have the fixed stars, and then you have the third intellect. It's very strange, I know. But basically, you're getting this emanating process, which is creating these byproducts, which are the planets, for example, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the sun, etc. And eventually you're going to get down to the 10th intellect, which is actually the active intellect. Remember, we talked about the active intellect before. The active intellect, even though it's the 10th one, it's kind of very important. The active intellect, the 10th intellect, is Gabriel, is symbolized by Gabriel. And that's how we come to know anything. We come to know anything because our mind interacts with the active intellect. The active intellect impresses upon us these forms, the form of the samosa, right? That's where all knowledge is in the active intellect, which gets it from God, by the way, by way of these emanations. Now, you might be asking, I definitely ask myself, what the heck is all of this? Why do we need all of these celestial bodies? Why is Farabi doing this? Why is he making it even more complicated? I don't know the answer, but I do have some ideas at least. I think number one is that they were trying to answer why these heavenly bodies exist. The Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the sun, etc. So that's number one. And number two is I suspect that there was a theological reason as well. I think they were trying to put intermediaries between God and us. That is, to protect God's transcendence. And there was this question, this philosophical question about how can God be one and then create the many, which is everything that you see in this world. And so one of the solutions they came up with is this kind of 10 intellects that are emanating from God. And this solved the one is to many philosophical problem. Now, you're still probably scratching your head, but the bottom line is that God emanates the universe necessarily from himself. Now, and then that's how the universe is created. This is very different than the theological conception of God that the Kalam scholars are using. So this is actually a difference that Western scholars put two different terms, give two different terms for it. The philosophers, the Islamic philosophers, are using the God of classical theism, whereas the theologians are often using the personal, what's called personal theism, I believe, or theistic personalism, sorry. So you have these two terms. One is classical theism and one is theistic personalism. In theistic personalism, God is more of this kind of person-like, it's a super person. But in the God of the philosophers, God is less of a person and more abstract. And we're going to talk about this. And Ghazali, by the way, is going to take the philosophers to task for this. So with this idea of the active intellect, Farabi is able to come up with the theory of prophecy. In his mind, first of all, a philosopher, remember, all human beings are interacting with the active intellect. The difference between a regular person and a perfect philosopher is that a perfect philosopher will have his mind fully actualized by the active intellect and thereby becomes an acquired intellect. That is, you not only know about samosas, you know about biryani, you know about everything that exists in the world. You become the acquired intellect because the active intellect is basically fully actualizing you. A prophet is a perfect philosopher. So just like we saw how saints and imams are going to be likened to prophets, similarly, philosophers are likening philosophers to prophets. We see this kind of universal theme going on. So a prophet is still revered because he is a philosopher, just like, remember, in the Shia conception, the prophet is also an imam. Similarly, the philosophers are saying that, yes, we have this high view of philosophers, but don't worry, the prophet is also a perfect philosopher. But the prophet has something in addition to what the philosopher has, and that is the prophet also has a fully developed imaginative soul. What is that? Well, according to Farabi and many of the Islamic philosophers, as well as the theologians will take this up too, by the way, the human soul has different parts to it. These parts are the rational part of the soul. That's our mind. That's the part that the philosopher is engaging with. Then you also have the imaginative. We're going to come back to that. But then there's also the sense perceptive. That's how we see things. That's how we see and eat samosas, right? We eat samosas, we taste them. That's the sense perceptive part of us. It's also part of the nutrition part of it, right? It sustains our body. Our body is kind of seen as inferior to this kind of rational intellect. And then there's the appetite as well, which is our desires. It's our desires to break our fast and eat the samosa, or our sexual desires. That's kind of, so we see that our human soul has these different parts to it. There's a rational part to it, and then there's also this imaginative. So let's talk about the imaginative, because that's what's specific to prophets. The imaginative part of the soul is that part of our mind that, for example, during sleep receives a dream. In dreams, objects often appear as symbols. The example I'm going to give is kind of funny. My wife had this dream a few weeks ago that she had a dream of this white-haired lady, and she was really mad at me when she woke up, and she said that you married an old white-haired lady and took a second wife, and I was threatening to leave you, and you said, fine, go ahead, take the house, take everything, don't worry about it. And then, funny, so she was mad at me that day, by the way, like legit angry at me. And then, funny enough, a couple of weeks later, we got a dog that's got white hair, and I've been falling in love with this dog, and she thinks that I'm ignoring her, and so she says that was her dream. So the white-haired lady, and we call the dog the white-haired lady now. And by the way, I think dogs are halal to take, so does Ghamidi Saab, relax on that. But anyways, the point is, though, that this dog represented this other thing. I mean, this white-haired lady represented the dog. So this is how, in their view, the prophet receives this kind of information. It's this, and it's a very naturalized process if you think about it, right? They're naturalizing the process of revelation. So the prophet just has a perfected imaginative soul. We all have imaginative souls. The only difference between a prophet is that he perfects this imaginative soul, and he is able to receive these images not only when he's sleeping, but and sporadically like we do, but also on an everyday basis, even while he's awake. So that's how he receives revelation, through the active intellect in the form of these images and symbols, which he then can convey to the masses and guide them to the right path. And this active intellect, by the way, again, is Gabriel. And this is the process of wahi, or divine inspiration, which in the case of the prophet was done even while he was awake, due to, again, how highly developed his imaginative faculty was. All right. So the Islamic philosophers are going to make a big deal about religion as being formulated in the language of symbols, metaphors, and allegories. This is a topic we're going to revisit in the next lecture, because again, it's important for the battle between Ghazali and the orthodoxy and the Islamic rationalists and philosophers. But for the Islamic philosophers, a virtuous religion is conveyed by a prophet to the people in the form of symbols, metaphors, and allegories in order to bring them to proper practice. Now notice, Farabi is using, this is Farabi, he's using just the term virtuous religion. He's not just saying Islam. So there might be more than one virtuous religion. So, all right. Different virtuous religions use different symbols, metaphors, and allegories as suitable to their time and their place. As long as these symbols point to the same reality, these other virtuous religions are acceptable, or at minimum, they'll get the job done. Now, so the Islamic philosophers did, therefore, hold a more universalistic or even pluralistic outlook to salvation. Of course, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, will say, and he's one of the Islamic philosophers, he will point out that ideally one should pick the best virtuous religion, which in his mind is Islam. So it's maybe more of an inclusivist approach to religion, where those other virtuous religions will get the job done, but really the ideal is Islam. Now I know you're probably thinking this is pretty crazy stuff. All this stuff about intellects and celestial bodies and emanations. Okay, let me ask you a question then. When you study the scientific worldview today, or you send your children to school to study it, do you feel that it reinforces your religious worldview, challenges it, or has nothing at all, nothing whatsoever at all? Oh, that's some bad grammar there. I should go back to school. But it has nothing whatsoever to do with it. What do you think? Well, in my view, I think it's probably not the first. It probably does not reinforce your religious worldview. It either challenges it or it has nothing whatsoever to do with it. If we look at studies, we find that scientists are more atheistic, have less belief in God than the general public, leading some people to make the more stronger claim that the more science you learn, the less religious you become. That's a questionable claim. But the point here is that, look, you see that in the general public, the people who identify themselves as clearly atheistic is a much smaller percentage. It's like 4% versus scientists who's 41%. Meanwhile, we see the situation of American Muslims being pretty dire, in one sense at least. 1 in 4 American Muslims leaves the faith. When asked why they leave the faith, well, they give many different reasons, but we see that most of them become atheists or atheistic, 55%. It seems to me, now, I'm not saying, by the way, that the only reason why they leave the faith is because they study these issues and they say religion classes with science or science classes with religion, so I'm going to leave the faith. I don't think it's really that straightforward. But what I do think is that most of us Muslims just take things like scientific theories, like the Big Bang Theory. We take the Big Bang Theory and we simply stick God right before it. Then we go to school and we study the natural sciences, completely ignoring God. In this worldview, God doesn't really need to exist. At most, he kicks off this whole process, but after that, science really takes over. Indeed, this is what we saw happen in the West with the rise of deism in the 19th century. God became a watchmaker. He simply winds up that watch, that world, and that universe, and then lets it go. And then he kind of sits back, and that's that. So deism is the idea that God created the world, but then he kind of steps back, and really you don't need God after that. And really, deism is kind of a stepping stone to atheism, because at that point in time, you're really like, do I really need God? Because God no longer plays an active role in our modern scientific worldview, I think it becomes easy for our youth to leave Islam. God just doesn't fit in this worldview anymore. God is not important. So as weird as we see the viewpoints of the Islamic philosophers, keep in mind, let's be charitable and at least do a charitable reading of them. I agree that the Islamic philosophers may have gone too far in some aspects. All this talk about celestial beings and active intellects, it seems fantastical, even pseudoscientific. As Peter Adamson puts it, it seems nuttier than the snacks at an elephant's birthday party. But much of the seeming unintelligibility is attributable, I think, to the fact that the science of that day was so different than our current understanding of the world. If we strip this fantastical element away and try to think about what the Islamic philosophers were doing, I contend that in many ways their project integrated their Islamic worldview into the science of their day much better than we do today. To see what I mean, let's take a look of our last philosopher for today that we're going to study, the great Ibn Sina. All right, Ibn Sina, he's known in the West as Avicenna. He was born in present-day Uzbekistan. He had to wander around due to political upheaval. He would go from patron to patron. He was a self-described prodigy. He was widely regarded as the leading master. And Professor Peter Adamson calls him not only the single most influential Islamic philosopher, but the single most influential medieval philosopher. Some of his achievements, well, he was a polymath. He was an admirer of Aristotelian philosophy, and he did work on Aristotle. but he actually reworked and rethought all of Aristotelian science. And he actually coined the term Eastern or Oriental philosophy. So he was of the view, so he completely retooled Aristotelian philosophy and made it fully Eastern or Oriental or Islamic, if you could think of it. So after Avicenna or Ibn Sina, he was so influential that after him, you no longer went back to Aristotle to read philosophy if you were trying to learn philosophy. Instead, now you're reading Ibn Sina. In fact, Ibn Sina was so influential that basically commentary after commentary, commentaries upon commentaries were written on Avicenna's work. By the way, he was also a physician. As we see, many of these philosophers were physicians, and Avicenna is credited for being the founder of early modern medicine. His book, The Canon of Medicine, remained in use even in Europe as late as 1650. He's also famous for the floating man experiment, which many people compare to Descartes' thought experiments, which kicked off the Western Enlightenment project. There are some substantial differences between these two thought projects, but basically what Ibn Sina asked was, he asked, what if we were created as just minds and we didn't have eyes, we didn't have hearing, we didn't have taste, we didn't have physical senses, would we still be able to think anything? And basically this is a thought experiment, which I think is similar in some ways to Descartes, where he kind of says, yes, we would still have self-awareness. And this is where he gets the idea of self-awareness, which then will be a proof for the existence of a soul, which again is similar to Descartes in some ways, but philosophers do point out that there are some major differences. All right, one of Ibn Sina's crowning achievements was his proof for the existence of God. This even though he was attacked by Ghazali on many fronts and theologians, one of his crowning achievements was his proof for the existence of God. This is the argument from contingency. I mentioned it, but I do want to go through it today. Recall again that the Kalam cosmological argument used the idea of cause and effect, right? Shaista is making, or I think I said Shazi is making the samosa. She is the cause. We see this effect. We're eating these samosas, so there must be a cause, right? So the universe is the effect and must therefore have a cause. So there must be something that precedes the universe in order to create it. In other words, there must be an artisan preceding the art, just as like there must be a house builder prior to the building of a house. This is the Kalam cosmological argument. But Ibn Sina is going to argue that the builder of the house is not actually the cause of the house, though he is responsible for moving the wood and placing it in the shape of a house. He's going to say that the actual cause that realizes the form of a house is those elements which take on the shape of the house. As long as the matter is there and the form is there, those are the two real sustaining causes that create the permanence of the house. If the house builder leaves, the house could be destroyed, the house builder could die, but really, as long as the matter and the form are there, that's what really causes the house to be there. And that's a quote by Ibn Sina. Immanuel Kant, an Enlightenment thinker, is going to say something similar, that causes are actually simultaneous with their effects. Think about a flashlight. When you turn the flashlight on, the flashlight is the cause, the effect is the beam, the light, but they're simultaneous. If the flashlight goes away, the light beam goes away too. So you see that there's this simultaneousness between the flashlight and the light it produces, which is important because this emanation theory of the universe is based on this similar concept of God emanating just like light or just like the sun. Let's take a train. So a train has a front car that moves, and then the second car moves with it. So the second car, the car behind it, is moving, but it only moves as long as, that's the effect, but it only moves, so it moves simultaneously with the cause, which is that first car that is moving. So this is another example of a cause and effect that are simultaneous. What about if you look at a mirror? If you look at a mirror, the effect is your reflection, and the cause is yourself, but they're simultaneous. If you move the cause, which is yourself, then the image, the reflection, goes away. It's simultaneous. And this is important because many of these Islamic philosophers are going to argue that God is like the actual thing, and we are, the world around us is simply the mirror image that's created through these intermediaries. And if you remove God, then that image, which is not really real, disappears. That's how important God is. Without God, the image, which is just a facsimile of that reality, disappears. Again, that's why this is important. Furthermore, it's important because the Kalam cosmological argument necessitates that we have God as just the first mover, the first domino. Again, remember I told you, you just put God right before the Big Bang, and that's all you need God for, to kick off the process. But then you don't need God after that. But Ibn Sina's argument about causes and effects is actually going to make God a whole lot more important. This is the argument from contingency. His argument starts with this idea that everything out there in the world can either be one of three things. I put two here, but they're actually three things. First, a concept could be impossible. What's something that could be impossible? Well, a square circle is impossible, right? It's just a logical absurdity. That can't exist. So that's an impossible thing. Then, as long as it's not an impossible thing, it has to be one of two things. This is what Ibn Sina is arguing. It can either be a contingent being, or it has to be a necessary existent. What's a contingent being? A contingent being is something that can exist, but it's equally possible that it doesn't need to exist. It's a possible thing. Not only that, a contingent being is something, because it's only possible, it relies on something outside of itself to exist. So for example, a samosa, I'm sorry to say, is a contingent thing, right? Because it requires someone to bring it into existence. So Shazia auntie Habib uncle has to make the samosa. And without Habib uncle making the samosa, you won't have a samosa. Is anybody going to say that samosas are necessary? Well, yes, for iftar we say they're necessary, right? But in reality, they're not necessary. So a samosa is only contingent. It's not necessary to exist. So Ibn Sina is arguing that everything in the world logically has to either be contingent or necessary. If it's necessary to exist because of its own essence. It's by its very essence is necessary. Now, whether or not a necessary existence actually exists or not, he's not saying yet. He's just saying theoretically, things have to fall into one of these two categories. So we've agreed that a samosa is contingent. It's not necessary by its existence. What about the plate that I'm eating the samosa on? Is that necessary, or is it just contingent? Well, the person who made the plate doesn't need to make that plate, right? And we could even break that plate or shatter it. So that's not really necessary. The plate itself is contingent. What about this laptop that I'm using right now? Well, Apple didn't need to make this laptop. They could have made one less laptop, right? They were sitting in a meeting, they decided, let's make this many laptops. They could have easily made one less laptop. So theoretically, there's no reason to say that it's not possible. So it's not a necessary thing. What about myself? Well, I really didn't need to exist. My parents could have decided not to have children. What about my parents? They equally might not have existed. Their my grandparents might have decided not to have kids. What about you? Same thing. Your parents might have decided not to have kids. What about human beings as a species overall? Well, we know, especially if we take kind of a naturalistic or even a methodological naturalism, we know that there's no real reason why humans have to exist. It was just a byproduct, this kind of evolutionary process. So human beings don't have to exist. What about the Earth? Well, even the Earth was just a happenstance. It might not have existed. There are tons of, if we take the multiverse theory, there are universes out there possibly that don't have Earth, right? So there's really nothing that we can look out to in the world and say necessarily has to exist. And what's important is that in Ibn Sina's view, this is not just a temporal argument, that is a time argument. So let's go back to the idea of the samosa. Think about the samosa. It's not just that somebody, the Habib uncle had to make the samosa. It's that even after you make the samosa, I had to look up what a samosa is made out of. I had no idea, by the way. I don't even know what is this maida? I have no idea what that is. But that's what apparently samosa is made out of. Now, that's what you break up a samosa those are the ingredients. If you remove these ingredients, it's no longer going to be a samosa. Now, if you break down any one of these objects, you can break it down even into its cells. And then you can break those. Now, is that the end of it? No. Cells are contingent themselves because they rely on molecules to form themselves, right? Cells rely on something outside of themselves to form. They rely on molecules. So here's where I am at. So let's show this. So the samosa consists of cells. Cells rely on molecules, but molecules themselves rely on atoms. Atoms rely on subatomic particles, and so on and so forth. Even if you go to quarks, which are and we're only going to go a few more minutes, I apologize. But even if you keep going, the point is that you can keep, even if you go down to quarks and you say quarks are the smallest object that could theoretically ever exist, are those quarks necessary to exist? I would argue that theoretically not. And that's why you need to have a necessary existent. So just finally, one last thing I want to show you, and this is from Professor Andani. He was kind enough to let me borrow his presentation. So this is Ibn Sina's argument. So he's going to argue again that there are contingent examples and necessary existence. So a contingent thing is something that, okay, that's the whole argument, by the way. I'm rushing through this because we're running out of time. But here's basically the argument. Take anything out there in the world. Take a samosa, take whatever you want. It's something that exists in the world. That thing that exists is contingent, right? We've agreed on it. It relies on something else. This other thing that it relies on, it could be either a contingent thing itself, or it could be a necessary existent. If you say depends on a necessary existent, then you've proved Ibn Sina's argument. Ibn Sina is just trying to prove that a necessary existent must exist. Now, most of us are going to say, no, that's not that easy. A samosa relies on cells. That's another contingent thing. Cells are contingent things. So we're going to go on this other pathway. Now, what about cells? Well, cells could depend, they themselves depend, they don't exist by themselves, by their very essence. They rely on something else to exist. So they might depend on a necessary existent, in which case, again, we've proved our arguments. But really, we're going to say no. Cells rely on protons and neutrons, etc. So they depend on other contingent beings. Those contingent beings, in turn, could depend. They are contingent, so they depend on something else. So again, they could depend on a necessary existent, but really, we're going to say they depend on another contingent being. And you're just going to keep going and basically say that each contingent thing relies on another contingent thing, and you can keep on going infinitely. This is the famous infinite regress that Islamic philosophers and philosophers in general are going to talk about. This is a logical absurdity that you would have an infinite regress of things. Now, you could take this whole set of contingent beings and argue that all of them are, we've said that individually they're contingent, they're not necessary, but what about all of them put together? Could they all then be considered necessary? Ibn Sina is going to argue that that's not plausible. That's not possible. Well, I'm combining three words, possible, plausible, all of them together. But basically, he's arguing that if all of the objects in the set are contingent, then the set overall is going to be contingent itself. That's important because basically an atheist could say, yes, all the things in the universe that you and I are pointing to are contingent, but the universe altogether is a necessary being. Ibn Sina is going to argue that can't be possible. They all must rely on something that's necessary. Now, I'm not going to be able to flesh out that argument fully here, and that's debatable whether that's defensible. I think it is, but this is basically the argument. He's arguing that since everything relies on this infinite regress, that regress has to end somewhere, and it must end in a necessary existent. And that necessary existent is going to be God. Now, of course, that argument, Ibn Sina is not naive enough to say that just once you've established the necessary existent, you've established that God exists. But he's going to then argue further that the attributes of this necessary existent It has to be immaterial, for example, because it can't be a contingent being consisting of parts. It has to be simple and not composed of parts. It can't be a body, etc. It has to be outside of the universe. So it has to be transcendent. He's basically going to make all of these arguments and come to these attributes which come close to the idea of this Abrahamic God. So that is the argument. Now, where Ghazali is going to fit in is that the Avicennan God, this is philosopher, the God of the philosophers, the difference between the theistic personalism of the theologians is that the God of the philosophers emanates everything from his own essence, and he does so necessarily. So just like the flashlight can, once it's turned on, emanates this light, it's a constant process. This is different than the concept that the theologians have, that you and I kind of grew up with the idea that God actively wills things, and he does so on an everyday, every moment to moment basis. This is very different than the conception of God that the Islamic philosophers take. In the Islamic philosopher standpoint, God is emanating constantly, and creation is a constant process, but it's an emanatory process. So it's not a one-off like deists would say, but it's not this kind of willing, discrete individual acts, but it's this downstream emanation that creates the universe and everything underneath it. So that is the God of the philosophers. We're almost done, just a couple more slides, I apologize. All right. So that is the necessary existent, the wajib al-wujud. That's going to be terminology that they're still teaching at Al-Azhar University, and that comes from Ibn Sina. So even if you think a lot of things he's saying are crazy and out there, one contribution he has given is this very strong argument for the existence of God. And this becomes the bedrock rational argument for the belief in God in the Islamic tradition, and goes to the Christian West as well. This is in addition, of course, to the Kalam cosmological argument. And for a more detailed review, please go straight to Professor Khalil Andani's video. He does a much more thorough job of explaining this difficult concept. And notice again that this argument does not depend on the universe beginning to exist. It works equally well for an eternal universe. In fact, the Islamic philosophers, as we will see in the next lecture, will argue that in fact, the universe has to be eternal. Why? Because God is the cause, and he is the creator. And you can't be a creator without having creation. You're just simply not a creator then. So just like the sun cannot help but emanate light, similarly God, by his nature, emanates all of creation. And he must always be present at every moment, otherwise the universe would cease to exist. So in the emanation scheme, God is always emanating light like the sun, which is always shining forth. Therefore, God is sustaining the universe at every single moment. Think of flashlight, it can't turn off. If it turns off, the light stops. In one sense then, it seems that in this model, everything has some divinity in it, although less intense than the one. So here you see that connection with Sufi thought. More problematically, does this God really have a will in the sense of actively choosing to create? It seems rather that in this conception, the one constantly emanates or overflows more like a magic orb than a personal God known to most followers of the Abrahamic faith traditions. Now, this is kind of a critical view of it, not a charitable view of their view of God. Well, then enters Ghazali, Imam Ghazali. It is on these grounds and some others that Imam Ghazali will step in and take aim at the Islamic philosophers. And we will take a look at Imam Ghazali's attack on the philosophers next week. And actually, that's when we talk about religion and science. So please join me on Wednesday for that. Join in our Google Classroom if you haven't. Upload your video. And we did get one. I wanted to share it today. I apologize. I'm going to actually hope that we post that on the Google Classroom. Subscribe to my YouTube. Email me with any questions or comments, and let's take questions. We can go a few minutes. I can go over time. I know people have to leave, so please leave. If you do, I apologize. Again, this was very complex material. And Maratib, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. When we discuss about Islamic worldview and its influence on external civilization, we mostly talk about Western civilization influence or Greek civilization or thought upon Muslim civilization. Whereas the other reality is also there, which is Eastern philosophies like Chinese, Hindus philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, which is very strong as other philosophy in contemporary world. So why Eastern philosophy could not influence upon Islamic philosophy, and although in today's world, more relevant philosophies are Eastern philosophies, as far as the peace of the world is concerned, or deep down meanings are concerned, not on a superficial level, but really, which the people talk about reality, what is reality. So can you explain it?
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. And then, by the way, I'm going to answer this question, and Reshma and Professor Attar, if you can stick around, I would love to have you ask those questions on video, just to increase the interaction. Those are great questions that you asked. So, Maratib Saab, to answer your question, I would say first and foremost, I would think that there is a bias in the Western Academy for sure, that because we're in the West, we definitely see things, our eyes glance more towards the Western influence. So there is that point. But the number 2 point is, I think the Islamic philosophers themselves, remember, they saw Aristotle as the first teacher. So they themselves are prioritizing the Western tradition over any Eastern traditions. I do think that we need to study the influence of Eastern traditions, but I do think that it is there, but I think it's a lot less. That's just my estimation of it. But I think the Islamic philosophers themselves are grasping on, and actually they're seeing themselves as the heirs of the Greek philosophy, and they see themselves as Western, like even though Ibn Sina creates that Oriental Eastern philosophy, in that traditional Islamic conception, they're claiming that Greek heritage, just like today the West claims that Greek heritage. And there is that historical connection between the two. And then the last point I would say is, I might hesitate to say that it's Eastern philosophy that today that's more relevant. I would say that maybe Western philosophy has become more secular, and that's part of it. And that's why we might not find it more relevant. But I think that it is sad that today Muslims, I was thinking of Allama Iqbal. I asked my professor about this. I was like, Allama Iqbal did write works on philosophy, just generalized philosophy. Even though we look at his work today, is his work read in the West? And the answer is no. I think that speaks a lot to whether you are on top of the world or not. You don't need to push your stuff if you're on top of the world and you're doing cutting edge philosophy and science. And so I think that shows the difference between today and back then. At that time, the Muslim world was at the top of the world, and now we're not. So that's just my comment on that. Okay, so let's take the next question. Ms. Reshma, do you want to ask a question if you're there?
Sure. I was just asking about the slide where I think it was by, was it Rosenthal? He was talking about Jewish mysticism and using the same framework. So I was curious about the influences there and the cross influence.
Thank you. So, and that's one reason why Peter Adamson actually calls his work, his introductory text, Philosophy in the Islamic World, because Jews were very much involved in this entire enterprise. I didn't talk about them today, but like Maimonides, for example, who is he's the Ghazali of Judaism. Maimonides was in the Arab Islamic world, and he was he was a philosopher. He was just like the Islamic philosophers. So he would have that term, philosopher. And then Jewish mysticism was actually influenced by Sufi mysticism as well as this Avicennan thought, as well as the Ibn Arabi strain, which takes this kind of Avicennan philosophy and mixes it with mysticism. So Jewish mysticism is definitely influenced, and it's a bilateral thing. It's not a one-way thing. So thank you so much for making us aware of that. Okay, next question, please. And this is by Professor Attar. Please go ahead. if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. Thank you so much. I had a very small question. I have always wondered who Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, saw when he ascended to Miraj. And I have always kind of wondered about that. And also, like, if you have any readings that you could indicate to go
Great.
along. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So last week we talked about the Mu'tazilis, who were the Islamic rationalists. They actually denied this meeting. And so remember, there's this issue about what do we take as, first of all, what do we take as reports as acceptable? And number two is stories, do we take them literally or do we allegorize them? Next lecture, we're gonna see how the Islamic philosophers are gonna allegorize a lot. And this is really things that many traditional Muslims will find uncomfortable, and you know, I hope I don't get stoned for sharing it with everyone, but they're going to allegorize all of this. So they won't believe in this kind of meeting. They believe that religion uses the language of symbols, metaphors, and allegories. So for example, Angel Gabriel is the active intellect, which in their worldview is a scientific entity. It's not this kind of just theological construct. And we're going to talk about that in full next class. I would want everybody to keep an open mind, because even if you're not going to go as far as the Islamic philosophers, I do think some of their ideas are useful in the sense of reconciling religion and science today, in which we do struggle, especially when it comes to the issue of evolution, which we'll briefly talk about next class. So thank you so much. All right. Mr. Raza Ali, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So when you were describing Avicenna and how his kind of emanationist model, you know, in that emanationist model, the world was, you know, continuing to emanate from it, from God. It reminded me of a couple of verses from Iqbal, where he says, "Ye kainat abhi na tamam hai shayad, ke aa rahi hai damadam sadaye kun fayakun." So I thought maybe he took his inspiration from there or something. But that was just a side comment. My question is, Fazlur Rahman was both a theologian and a philosopher, and he did some work regarding prophecy. I just want to find out what did he add on top of what you described today.
Great. Those are two great points and questions. So I am definitely interested in Muhammad Iqbal and Fazlur Rahman. I would say that I am still developing as a scholar and student, so I can't claim to be experts on everyone across the boards. Keep in mind that in this class I do get time to prep. What I would say is that there definitely is influence. So Professor Fazlur Rahman did get into trouble for his views on prophecy, as you know, and that's actually the reason why, one of the major reasons why he had to flee the country. There was this idea of naturalizing the process of prophecy, and he is definitely being influenced by and interacting with ideas of Farabi. But as far as the exact details, I don't want to go off the top of my head because I might make an error. So what I can do is, when we get to the class on Islamic modernism, I can try to insert some of that into that discussion. So thank you so much for that. And you probably, I can tell just by your reading, you probably have some ideas on that as well. So thank you so much. All right, Muhammad Ishaq. Mr. Muhammad, do you want to ask that question on video, please? Are you still there? If not, I think you are. And someone asked if the URL for the Zoom meeting stayed the same every time. I think it does. All right, so I'll just ask Muhammad's question and then we'll call it a break because we are going way over time now. God has other creations like angels, so he is a creator and has a creation. By creating universe, he adds to it, isn't he? But that, I think if I've understood your question correctly, that would still be under the assumption that God has created angels, right? So he did create something. and angels are part of the universe. Whether they're part of the heavenly or temporal universe is a different question. So everything other than God is considered the universe, really. And so the question is, was there a time that there was nothing? Now, the problem with that is that that would mean, remember, space and time are created. So the Islamic philosophers are going to argue, what do you mean there's a time before time? That doesn't make any sense. But this is a debate we're going to talk about next class, because Imam Ghazali is going to go to war with the Islamic philosophers over the idea of the eternity of the universe. So that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much. We'll meet back on Wednesday to talk about Ghazali. We're going to pick up with the rest of the Islamic philosophers. We're going to continue with Ibn Sina. Then we're going to go to Ghazali's critique. We're going to talk about Ibn Rushd then, who is my favorite philosopher. And then we're going to talk about Ibn Tufail after that, who has a very interesting story that you may have grown up with, Hayy ibn Yaqzan, but you may not have actually understood, or as you read it as a kid, you might not realize how philosophical and radical that text is. So thank you so much. I'll see you next week. Assalamu alaikum. And go eat some samosas.